Hola, bienvenidas y bienvenidos en nombre de MAFRE, KBR, Fundación MAFRE. Es un placer estar aquí de nuevo en esta nueva
Fundación Mafre. I'd like to welcome you all.
fotografía
It is a
y
pleasure
exposición.
to
La
be here in
conferencia de
this
hoy
conference, which is part of our cycle,
una exposición que
Photography and Exhibition. Today's
emblemática
conference revolves around an
Pavilion
iconic
de Franco
exhibition,
Vaccari,
the
que
exhibition by
inauguró
Franco
aquí en
Vaccari,
la Bienal
who was
de
invited
Venecia,
to
pabellón
the
italiano,
Venice Biennale
en la Bienal
in
del 72,
1972 as part of the
y
Italian
instalar un
Pavilion. He
fotomatériau
decided to
en
set
la
up
sala
a photo booth in a
invitando
completely empty
que
room,
fueran los
inviting
propios
the viewers,
asistentes a la exposición, a los propios espectadores,
inviting
que fueran dejando
the
un rastro de
guests
su visita
to leave a
y
trace of their visit
poniendo
and
sus
to stick
retratos hechos
their
aquí con
photo
carboncillo,
strips
ocupando así
to the
las
walls
paredes de la
of
sala. Un
the room,
gesto pues
to
que desde luego
occupy the room
significaba
with their pictures. This is
asuntos
a gesture
fundamentales
that
respecto a la
challenged
escuela artística,
fundamental
de
suppositions regarding the
la
artistic system, the notion of
originalidad,
authorship
el
and
rol de los
originality,
espectadores
the role of
y también la
viewers, of
idea de
course,
fotografía
and also the idea
que
of
Vaccari
photography itself,
planteaba desde un
which
punto de
for
vista
Vaccari
social mucho más
was
importante.
approached from
Estos, entre otros
the
muchos aspectos
viewpoint of
son
photography
los
as
que
a
llegaron a un
social
punto, a un
agency,
paso tan significativo. Nuestra
amongst
invitada
other
de hoy
aspects. That's why it is such a significant exhibition. Our guest today, Nicoletta Leonardi, is a renowned specialist in Baccari,
en profundidad toda la exposición
and she'll
y
be
daremos
analyzing this
lugar
exhibition in
a
depth.
otros
And
trabajos
we'll also
de Vaccari
discuss
y
other
esta
works by
pieza
Vaccari.
fundamental
Vaccari
para
is a
entender
fundamental
las
author
transformaciones
if
que
you want to
vivieron
understand the
finales de los
transformations
60, principios de los años
in the
70,
late 60s and early
la
70s,
movilización de las relaciones entre arte y
which
fotografía y
profoundly changed
exposición,
the relations between art,
transformaciones que
photography,
por otra
and
parte
exhibition.
no podían
These
ser comprendidas
changes
con
cannot be fully
suficiencia
understood
sin
or
entender el
analyzed
contexto
without
cultural
taking the
tan
Italian
importante
cultural and political
italiano
context into
y
account,
también en general el internacional tan
and
importante
also the
a los que también
political
hacen
climate
alusión
in
en
other
su obra.
countries, which Nicoletta will
Nicoletta
also be
Leonardi es profesora de
approaching.
Historia de la
She is a
Fotografía
professor of history of photography at the
online.
Brera Academy
Su
of Fine
labor
Arts in
investigadora
Milano.
versa
Her
sobre la
research revolves
utilización de
around
la historia de la fotografía
overcoming the history
en
of
el movimiento
photography
específico
as a
a
specific
favor
medium
de un
in favor
enfoque
of an
cuyo
approach
estudio permite
from which
estudiarla
you can
en
study
campo más
photography
amplio que
as
integra
part of
tecnologías
a
técnicas
broader
y
field
sistemas diversos.
which incorporates
La
diverse
teoría
artifacts,
moderna
systems, and
del arte
technologies.
incluye la
More
fotografía
recently,
y el sentido del lugar en la Italia posterior a la Segunda Guerra Mundial y,
her work
por otra parte,
focuses on photography and the sense of
el
place in
estudio de
Italy
la
after the
creación,
Second World
el
War.
uso y la circulación
And
de
also,
fotografías
she
en
focuses
la
on the use and
investigación
circulation of
y el
photography
conocimiento.
in research, in
También
scientific research and
colabora
communication in the 19th century. She's also published
artículos
different books
interesantes
and
que,
a
por supuesto,
long
siguen
number of articles, which of
aportando
course
valor.
I invite you to read.
Empezaré
I would like to
uno de
stress
sus
or
libros,
to
por ejemplo,
mention some of her
los
books,
traduzco al castellano, aunque algunos están en
which
italiano.
I will
Por
be
ejemplo, El paisaje americano del siglo
mentioning
XIX,
in
que
Spanish.
es un libro del 2013,
American
y
Landscape
Feedback, que es otro
in the
sobre
19th
el libro de
century,
Franco Vaccari, publicado en
Feedback
2007.
on Franco Vaccari, published in 2007, Fotografia Materialità in Italy, published in 2013, and she's also been a co-editor with Simone Latali on Photography and Other Media in the 19th century
Está trabajando en un
from
volumen sobre
2018.
fotografías, teorías biológicas del crimen y cultura popular
She is now
en
writing a book on
2020
photography,
y
biological
también
crime
un libro
theories, and
sobre
popular culture in the second half of the 19th century. And she's also
liderado
involved
por
in a
arte
project,
y escuelas de artes
a research
aplicadas,
project on
incluyendo la
photography as an
postunificación
educational
a
tool
partir de
in
la
art
Segunda Guerra
academies,
XIX.
fine art schools
Por
in
último,
the
subrayar
post-unification Italy.
la importancia de sus
Lastly, I'd
investigaciones
like to
que han
mention
habido reconocimientos
that her
de
research
instituciones tan importantes como
has
la
been awarded by
FPV,
major
la
institutions such as
Fundación
the
Nacional
Hasselblad
de las Artes
Foundation, the
Luxemburgo,
Centro Nacional de Audiovisual in
el
Luxembourg,
Instituto
the Italian Ministry of Culture or the Fulbright program, from which she's received different awards and grants for research, the results of which have been presented in prestigious museums and entities such as the Chicago Art Institute, the Photo Museum Winterthur, and the University of Harvard, the University of New York, the University of Zurich, Montfort, and the University College of London, where she obtained her PhD. And for those of you who are joining us today for the first time, let me remind you that you can ask questions and make comments and remarks using the tab that says questions. And your comments and questions will be answered after Nicoletta's presentation during the Q&A. The conference will be in English. You can either listening in English or follow the interpretation into Spanish, clicking on the interpretation tab. Nicoletta Leonardi, welcome, and thank you very much for being here with us today. It is a pleasure for us to welcome you.
Okay, so can I start? Okay, good.
Muy bien.
So, thank you, Marta, for such a generous introduction, and I'm very grateful to you for conceiving this very interesting and much needed cycle of conferences on photography and exhibition. And I'm grateful for Fondation Mapfre for inviting me along with you and the staff. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Okay, so at the 36th edition of the Venice Biennale, which was held in 1972, the show, the whole exhibition was strongly shaped by the political climate of the late 1960s and early 1970s. In fact, 4 years earlier, in June 1968, the opening of the 34th Biennale was struck by marches, disorders, clashes with the police, as you can see here in these pictures. And during the 3 days opening in June, because the Biennale has an opening that lasts 3 days, students, intellectuals took to the streets to protest against the institution which they considered an expression of the bourgeois capitalist establishment. So the protesters brandished banners that denounced the policed biennial of the bourgeoisie. As a matter of fact, policemen were guarding the entrance of the Biennale in that edition. And the protesters also accused the Biennale of being a fascist institution, because in 1968, as well as in the following years, the statute of the Biennale was still the one enacted in 1930, when the institution's control passed from the city of Venice to the fascist government under Benito Mussolini. So the protesters in 68 questioned the institution on matters such as freedom of speech and vilified it because it had a sales department. So it functioned as a commercial art gallery. And so the protesters accused the Biennale of being a capitalist playground for the rich, because this is a public institution that has a sales department. So political activists occupied some of the national pavilions and turned the artworks to face the walls or covered the map with anti-wars banners. Artists themselves took part in the protests, artists from different countries, and they both participated in the demonstrations, but also that they covered up or turned to the walls their own works. So thanks to this mess, to this turmoil, to these protests, more provocative curatorial agendas were set for the subsequent biennales, which were then established as more lively forums for cultural debate. Okay, so 68 had a big impact on the biennales to come, especially in the 1970s. As a consequence of the 68 protests, for instance, among other things, the sales office was eliminated, and the celebratory retrospective historical exhibitions on single artists were given up in favor of thematic exhibitions on contemporary artistic productions. So in 1972, for the first time, the national participants were invited to follow the theme proposed by the Italian pavilion, which was work of art or behavior. The Italian pavilion's exhibition, which was actually made up of two different shows, separate but complementary, showcased the passage from the work of art conceived as a finished and autonomous object to the work of art conceived as an open, unfinished, behavioral process. The exhibitions, both exhibitions, traced a direct lineage, a direct passage from informale, from arte informale, from informel, to arte povera, conceptualism, and performance. So the work of art exhibition comprised paintings by established Italian informale artists, such as the one you can see in the screen, which is a work by Mattia Moreni. The show on behavior, on the other hand, comprised more experimental works by younger generation artists, such as Franco Vaccari. They were all in their 20s, early 30s. This is Franco Vaccari, Mario Merz, who was older, Luciano Fabbro, Germano Livotto, and Gino De Dominicis. The show was curated, the behavior show, the behavior section of this sort of bipolar show, was curated by Renato Barilli, who was a literary and art critic, and he wrote about a new, open, mundane informale emerging within Italian artistic productions, such as arte povera, body art, conceptual art, and taking the form of environments, happenings, performances, and behaviors of sorts. These new artistic practices that Barilli defined as expanded informale took place in real time and in real space, using the body, creating ephemeral installations, stimulating a more participatory response by the public, and adopting technological tools such as photography, film, and video. Along these lines, and in the attempt to give art a more public and social dimension, the 1972 Biennale offered events both inside the traditional exhibition spaces and outside in the city. This, for instance, is the project that was organized by artists representing Belgium. Belgium participated with an art collective. The name of this collective was Mass Moving Project. This collective was composed of artists and engineers, and they produced ludic, ephemeral, urban actions based on participation. So at the 1972 Biennale, the Mass Moving Project installed an incubator containing a live colony of about 10,000 butterfly eggs, and this is in Piazza San Marco. The incubator was an irregular polyurethane portable lab. It was 7 meters high and nearly 10 meters wide. It contained heated cells with water and honey. So after undergoing the last phase of their metamorphosis, the butterflies were supposed to be released at night by attracting them through some strong light projectors. This project was very controversial and generated much debate. As a consequence, the release of the insects was delayed day after day, because on the one hand, the local animal rights associations were worried about the destiny of these butterflies and tried to stop their release from taking place. On the other hand, Venetians worried about the butterflies being dangerous, a possible threat to the public hygiene and agriculture, and did not change their mind, not even when they were reassured several times that the insects were harmless and beneficial for pollution and the rebalancing of the biological cycles. So when the butterflies were finally released, it was far from what people expected, because a good portion of the animals had died and the rest came out very slowly and in small groups, to the disappointment of the public and the media. But let's get back to the behavior exhibition in the Italian pavilion. As you might have noticed from the slides that have, from the photographs that I've showed before, not all the artists in the show presented what could be fully identified as a happening or a performance or a behavior. Certainly, Gino De Dominici's project did, and his complex installation generated what is perhaps the most prominent scandal in the history of the Venice Biennale, because the installation was entitled Second Solution of Immortality, the Universe is Motionless, and consisted of both artworks that Dominici had already presented before, together with some new living elements, two young twins, a dancing couple, an old man sitting on top of the roof, hanging in a chair that was hanging in 4 meters high, and a young man with Down syndrome seated in a corner. And as you can see here, there is this old lady that approaches the person seated, the man seated, and takes her glasses off because she can't believe what she's actually seeing. So during the first day of the vernissage, the presence of this seated man with Down syndrome caused a sensation and attracted a lot of attention and outrage, criticism, so that in less than an hour, so this only lasted an hour, and in less than an hour, the artist first replaced him with a little girl, and then was forced to close the room. I won't linger on the Dominici's work, the scandal it produced and its resonance in the media, because it's an extremely interesting and multifaceted story that would require a talk of its own. But another artist in the Italian pavilion whose work could certainly be inscribed within the framework of happenings, performances, behaviors is Franco Vaccari. In his allocated exhibition space, Vaccari placed a commercial self-service photo booth. And then he also put on the wall a message directly addressed to the public and translated into 4 languages. And the message said, "Leave on these walls a photographic trace of your fleeting visit." Actually, yes, of your fleeting visit. So Vaccari's artistic strategy was clearly centered on displacement. The photo booth, an object typically belonging to urban public spaces, such as railways, sidewalks, and normally used for the production of multiple low-cost images, was placed in the prestigious and authentic exhibition space of the Venice Biennale. Such an act clearly was meant as a critique of the art system with its self-referential aesthetic criteria of authorship, originality, and economic value. A flood of cheap ID portraits originated from the mechanical, non-authorial apparatus gradually accumulated on the walls of the Italian Pavilions exhibition space, usually reserved for great artists. Vaccari borrowed the photo booth from Dedem, the first and still operating Italian company in the production and installation of photo ID picture cabins. This company was founded in 1962 with the mission of filling up Italy with automatic photo booths for immediate photo printing based on the technology developed in the UK by the company PhotoMe. The delivery time of the photo strip was then around 3 minutes. I think today now it's a little less. And the cost was 100 lire, which is more or less the equivalent of today's 5-10 cents of a euro. So by 1964, it was a big success. And by 1964, Dedem had thousands of photo booths operating all over Italy. So the photo booth Vaccari placed at the Italian Pavilion was operated exactly as like when commonly used in the street. So those who wanted to participate in the exhibition had to pay the regular price. So they had to pay the 100 lira, okay? And what is also extremely interesting, as you can see here in these two pictures, is that at the beginning, the curtain for that separated the inside and from the outside of the cabin was long, but then all sorts of strange people happened inside the cabin. So the Biennale organizers decided to cut the curtain so that people inside it could be seen, okay? So many visitors complied, were happy to comply, and the walls of the gallery were quickly covered up with photo strips. And we have here many examples of people having fun at the show. And this is what the wall looked like. People would hang their photo strips, and as you can see, there were all sorts of behaviors taking place within the cabin. And this is an example of how Vaccari then put together the strips according to, for instance, in this case, groups of people. But also, as you can see here, many artists participated. Here we have at the center Cunellis, and then we have Palazzoli, who was a gallerist and a collector, a famous gallerist and collector. And then on the far right, you have someone who says, go to Documenta Kassel, because while the Biennale was taking place, another legendary exhibition was also taking place in Kassel, the 1972 edition of Documenta, curated by Harald Zeman. This is Boltanski at the center, as you can see, taking his selfies. And this is Ugo Mulas, the photographer, here on the left. And these are other examples of, this is a communist guy who wanted to make sure that people would know about it, because he has the communist newspaper L'Unità with him. And this is how Vaccari, after the exhibition in real time took place at the Venice Biennale, the exhibition in real time finished when the Biennale closed, and then Vaccari showed his work in this fashion. he glued some strips on cardboards and then framed them and showed them as I'm illustrating now. In different, and he also made some enlargements of some photo strips. Okay, so as part of the Biennale project, Vaccari made a book, and the book featured a selection of over 2,000 of the photo strips left on the walls by the visitors. The book was published in 1973, and in order to fund this publication, during the 3 days vernissage, Vaccari handed out signed and numbered certificate of participation to those who took part in the project. So these certificates were printed on cardboard, as you can see, and they included a detachable postcard, which the participants were supposed to return to the artist by mail with their own addresses. So many returned the postcards, and when the book came out in 500 copies, Vaccari was able to inform the people involved via post, many at least of the people involved, those who had returned the postcard. So he figured that people's interest in a book where they featured would guarantee at least the covering of the printing costs. But not only he was right, actually his expectations were exceeded, because when the 500 copies reached the bookstores, they were sold out in a matter of days. So right after his participation at the 1972 Biennale, Vaccari learned that Dedem, the photo booth company that supplied the cabin for his exhibition, was actually using his work for advertising purposes. Flyers, as you can see here in this portion of the image, flyers posted on photo booths all over Italy invited people to take their pictures and leave them in a tin box designed for the purpose, appended to the original structure. And the message was, leave a photographic trace of your passage. At the 36th Biennale, a photo booth of this type was used to take photographs of men, women, and children of any age and nationality that will be published in a book. You too are invited to leave your most expressive and natural photographs in the appended box. The most interesting pictures will be published. We invite you to write your name and address on the back of your photographs. So after seeing this poster, Vaccari decided to take direct action on the photo booths on the streets, thus moving his initial project from the closed space of the exhibition to the urban context. So we have from the urban context to the photos, to the gallery, to the art gallery, and back to the urban context. So he asked Dedem for permission to use all the photo booths across Italy for 1 year. To attract participants, he designed his own advertising poster for the search for novice actors for a movie production. So his intention was indeed that of making a film using all the photo strips collected at the end of the year in a continuous sequence. The project lasted a year. So placed on the exterior of the cabins, these posters invited users, again, to leave their photos with their names, addresses, and in this usual box. This was, of course, a work of art accessible, Vaccari offered to people the opportunity to participate in to be part of a work of art that was accessible on a 24-hour basis. And the booth, according to Vaccari, offered a moment of self-consciousness, a pause in the rigid chain of life's events, This project also with this project also Vaccari produced many photographs of documentary photographs of photo cabins, which are extremely interesting and not very much published. I think this part of Vaccari's archive needs more attention, because it's really an interesting documentation of the history of photography in Italy, the history of photography and urban history. So those who responded to the artist's call, this is another way in which Vaccari then exhibited and sold his work. Here we see the photo booth near the entrance at the station of Florence, at the Florence train station. So when the project came to an end, about a year after, the artists had collected thousands of photo strips from all over parts of Italy. And he put them together in different ways according to the sitter's residence, place of residence, or the place where the photos were taken, their gestures, their clothes, their hairstyles, their attitudes. So the photo strip offer a social and anthropological self-representation of Italy between 1973 and 1974. Now, in order to fully understand Vaccari's project at the 1972 Venice Biennale and its sequel across Italian cities, it is important to briefly consider the major themes at the basis of his artistic work. The dissolution of the modernist aesthetic object and the use of photography not as a fine art, but as a contextual and serial product of mass culture. The use of media, such as photography, film, and video, to transform the viewers into active participants, and the attention to the unnoticed and the unmapped terrain of the everyday, the banal, the ordinary, as opposed to the remarkable and the epic. The adoption of modes of viewing and recording associated with the archive, with the model of the archive, is another interesting aspect of this type of work. And also the attempt to establish an inventory of material culture in order to construct a possible narrative, a possible narration of the self and the conditions of the culture industry. So all these elements together situate his artistic production, Vaccari's artistic production, within a particular area of conceptualism, to which belong the works of other artists who worked with photography, such as James Coleman, Dan Graham, Hans Ake. Among the aims of these artists was the overcoming of the traditional separation between the private sphere and the public sphere, and the traditional separation between the institutional artistic spaces of the museum and the gallery and the urban spaces, okay? So also in their works, public spaces are no longer as only physical, just physical entities. The public spaces in their work cannot be defined, does not appear as just a physical entity, but as material and semiotic network of communication and exchange, in which living beings and objects are both social agents. So Vaccari presents photography as a social agent, as something that can act upon reality, that can produce change, that can be a tool for activating communication, okay, among people. So, and this approach, within this approach, a a geography of tensions, desires, fears, memories, of a public that is no longer considered as a single collective body, but as a diversified ensemble of individuals situated in very peculiar cultural, social, geographical, and economic conditions appear. And so this type of complexity appears in the work, is present in the works. So Vaccari's exhibitions in real time are an important part of this chapter of the history of neo-avant-garde artistic practices, in which photography has a big role, and also the way working with photography and exhibiting photography changed has a big, is a big part of this chapter. So the exhibitions in real time were structured upon the principle of accumulation, as you have seen, and centered on collective participation. So by reducing his authorial presence to a minimum level, so what Vaccari did, it just triggered the event, okay? It just gave the first input, but then he sort of disappeared. So by reducing his authorial presence to a minimum level, Vaccari exposed public spaces, societal processes as networks in which human and non-human actors, such as photography, move through time and space, interacting with each other and acting upon reality, producing effects, okay? So photography as an agent, as a social agent that has a life, that lives in time and space, that have effects that are not controlled by its author, okay? So the exhibitions in real time developed in relation to the ways in which the spectators turned into participants, suddenly emancipated from the status of mere viewers, perceived them and reacted to them, contributing to their shape and to their form and to their meaning. Okay, so this is precisely what Vaccari meant with the notion of an exhibition in real time and space. As a matter of fact, he claimed that, and I'm quoting him, the difference between happenings, performances, and exhibitions in real time is a difference in structure. While the first two develop in a linear way, obeying to precise predeterminate programs throughout the different stages of their development, the exhibitions in real time are characterized by the possibility of feedback. So the exhibitions in real time also broke, as you have seen, the traditional confines between museums and urban spaces. They presented photography not as a fine art to hang on a white wall, but as a material object and a social agent operating across society. They engaged with the challenge posed to subjectivity and its representations by the massive invasion in daily life of new technologies and the mass media. So they explored, in a way, the historical necessity and the very possibility of resuscitating portraiture as a way of creating an everyday form of resistance, of critical thinking, as a way of contrasting the totality of spectacle by reactivating relational processes, fun. Let's have fun, for instance, just as simple as that. But let's take a step back and look at the cultural context in which Vaccari developed his idea of the exhibitions in real time, as well as at what he did with his notion of photography as action and not contemplation before the 1972 Venice Biennale. Vaccari was born in 1936, and when he was a young artist, Italy was in the middle of its economic miracle. It was in the middle of a period of momentous change in society and culture that took place between the late 1950s and the 1960s. During this time, the country went from a poor, mainly rural nation into a major industrial power. So it was a big change that had a huge impact upon society. And this change affected everyday life, consumption habits, and leisure time activities. So faced with these profound transformations, a great portion of artists and intellectuals started pondering about how the country's cultural forces should maybe react to and eventually resist this huge capitalist wave invading the country. So during those years, the Italian literary and artistic neo-avant-gardes advocated a dialogue among different art and cultural forms. For instance, Umberto Eco, an Italian internationally famous intellectual, Umberto Eco's notion of opera aperta, open work, which gained widespread popularity during the 1960s, is an expression of this cultural climate. Eco was a member of the neo-avant-garde literary movement Gruppo 63, and he argued that aesthetic codes always stem from a given reality and reflect society and its changes, and that contemporary art is an open and ambiguous form of interpersonal communication that requires the readers/viewers' active participation, and that is subject to a plurality of interpretation. So these neo-avant-garde writers, visual artists, architects, and designers in Italy were indeed convinced that culture and the arts could offer an effective form of resistance. They aimed at re-establishing a non-alienated language by producing works based on social critique and works based on the merging of different media and forms of expression, on producing works based on intersubjectivity and reception. So this is particularly true, for instance, with regard to artists working in the area of concrete, sound, and visual poetry, such as those belonging to Gruppo 63, to which Umberto Eco belonged. Concrete, sound, and visual poets advocated the overcoming of single authorial figures through the creation of collective poems. They conceived poetry as an impersonal, objective, and immediate form of communication that resulted from the relationship between different components of language: semantic, graphic, oral, spatial. So they took into account also the materiality of language. In order to understand Vaccari's exhibitions in real time, it is important to mention that his career began not only with photography, film, and video, but also with visual and concrete poetry. In other words, Vaccari was a visual and concrete poet, besides being a visual artist using photography, film, and video. So since the very beginning, Vaccari's cross-media practice always emphasized materiality. So it is within this perspective that he embraced Eco's concept of openness, of open work, and conceived visuality as a part, as an integral part of the material and collective forms of social action and interaction. So not visual, he didn't think of photography as a visual medium. He thought about photography as a material, multisensory object, okay? And this is extremely important. So what were Vaccari's photographic references? First of all, in 1955 in Italy, was published, Einaudi published, an important Italian publisher, published a book conceived by neorealist screenwriter Cesare Zavattini and photographer, American documentary photographer Paul Strand. The book was entitled Un Paese, a village, and it was produced with the idea of creating a dialogue between cinema, literature, and photography. It was a documentary project structured on the principle of presentation versus representation. So it was based on Luzzara. The book was based on Luzzara, a village in the Po Valley, and also Zavattini's hometown. The mission of the book, according to Zavattini, was that of getting away with all forms of poeticity and focus on the banal and marginal aspects of everyday life in the small rural town in Emilia. To the extent of my argument here, the most interesting aspect of this book is that the legends of the photographs are direct testimonies of the people portrayed, collected by Zavattini through either written notes or sound recordings. So I don't know if you're able to read or if you can read Italian, but these people are just telling banal facts about themselves, facts that belong to everyday life. Another extremely important source of inspiration for Vaccari, for the young Vaccari, was William Klein. Vaccari bought Klein's books on New York and Rome immediately upon their publication in 1956 and in 1959. He was fascinated by Klein's crude and direct photographic style, his distance from the well-controlled and balanced compositions typical of humanist photography. And this is an example of Klein's work. So what you see here is Klein's ability to represent the materiality of a city and to linger on seemingly marginal aspects of urban life. Also by taking up dialects, forms of everyday conversations. So in both books, let's go back. In both books, the authors, what the authors do is they step back, and the city's materiality, the city, in case of Rome and New York, or the village materiality, as well as people's voices, mostly people's voices, appear not so much as represented again, but as presented. There is this sort of change. Another source for inspiration for Vaccari was The Way of Zen, published by Alan Watts, one of the first best-selling books on Buddhism, and sort of a Bible of the counterculture movement of the 1960s. Through Watts' book, Vaccari became acquainted with the haiku poetical form, and what he liked, it's a Japanese poetical form, and what he liked about haikus. Vaccari liked haikus because they were short and they were simple poems, and they were able to generate sort of micro awakenings without any form of conceptualization. So haikus became the poetic model through which Vaccari could observe the realities of Italian cities in the 1960s. So most importantly, the artist applied the haiku model and techniques not only to words, but as we shall see in a minute, to photographs as well. So what Vaccari did is that he used newspapers, illustrated magazines, printed advertising materials, and he cut out words, as you can see here, and bits of sentences, then threw them out on a table and reassembled them to form poetic compositions inspired by the haiku poetical form. In 1965, with these poems, with these visual poems, Vaccari published a collection of entitled Entropico. The book's title, Entropico, makes direct reference to what artists and intellectuals of the time considered the anthropized status of language and communication in the mass media. So what Vaccari is trying to do here is present a form of resistance against mass culture enacted by manipulating and rearranging advertising messages and slogans of sorts with the aim of recovering a non-alienated meaning for words and images. He used the ready-made model, and he deliberately kept artistic codification, again, to the minimal level. So again, what he wanted to do is move away from any sort of artisticity or anything immediately recognizable as poetic. So in the meantime, he explored urban spaces and he photographed and filmed what he defined as found poetry, graffiti on city walls and in public toilets, tears, scribbles and drawings on billboards. So besides making poems, he also made this collage in which he used his own photographs, cutouts of photographs, graphics, and texts from a plethora of printed media. And he considered these works visual poems, just like the ones published in his book. And so as a visual artist, simultaneously experimenting with photography, film, poetry, Vaccari, what Vaccari wanted to do is he wanted to break the self-contained dimension of the book and the page by transforming them into living spaces to be filled with the realities of every day, with the material and multisensorial experience of walking in the streets of Italian cities. And so Le Tracce, a book that he published in 1966, offers an example of this interest, of this approach, and of his consistent interest in the urban environment. The volume, which was published by visual and concrete poetry publisher San Pietro Edizioni in Bologna. The book contains only photographs, and almost all of them are graffiti-related images taken in various Italian cities during the first half of the 1960s. And here are some examples. So with his anthropological gaze decisively turned towards material culture, Vaccari collected fragments of urban reality and relocated them into the book. The book presents themes and strategies typical of Vaccari's exhibitions in real time, which came after this. The overcoming of the traditional notion of the author in favor of a collectivity of autonomous voices, such as this image here clearly illustrate. The emergence of the urban space as a privileged site for experimental artistic research. And in perfect tune with the legacy of arte informale, of informel, and with the reduction of the self advocated by the literary neo-avant-gardes, Vaccari conceived photography, again, as a multi-sensory jump into the world, an unprecedented encounter with what one does not know. So his use of the camera was antithetical to Cartier-Bresson's authorial search for a decisive moment. His intention was indeed not so much to create images, but to immerse himself in the base reality of the everyday, recording the rich interplay of voices, of fragmented voices, echoing from the walls, the toilets, the billboards of Italian cities. So Le Tracce depicts graffiti as an instrument of emancipation from and resistance to both, on the one hand, the Catholic code of conduct of the Catholic Church, prescribed by the Catholic Church, and the stereotypical mythologies of mass consumption and that circulated in the media at that time. See, this is a perfect example. And this is a last picture, which is actually a man listening to the radio, to a football game on the radio, as always happened, which was a typical image in Italy up until the early 80s. Okay, so the book offers an anthropological, sociological, and psychological portrait of the country during the economic miracle and at the dawn of the contestation movement of 1968. After Vaccari brought fragments of urban materiality into the book by presenting graffiti as visual and concrete found poetry, he reversed this strategy by translating visual and concrete poetry into public spaces and exploring environments, happenings, and performances. So this is the road that took him to the exhibitions in real time. In 1968, in particular, he created an installation inspired by French actor and the theater director Antonin Artaud, who conceived theater not as a staged performance before a passive audience, but as a primitive ceremonial experience based on the communion between actor and audience. So at the time, experimental theater was a big thing in Italy and raised great interest among visual and performing artists, as well as writers and cinematographers. For instance, the expression arte povera was taken from Polish theater director and theorist Grotowski's idea of poor theater. So Vaccari greatly appreciated the non-narrative and informal dimensions of experimental theater in general, and he was especially fond of Artaud's emphasis on physicality. He liked the way actors and objects appear on the stage of Artaud's theater, not as a representation, but as a real presence. So inspired by Artaud, Vaccari brought the materiality of the city, and particularly of the city's waste, of the city's rubbish, into the exhibition space. So he built a labyrinth using objects taken from the city's dump: doors, cans, wooden tables, street signs, and he also used 6 big letters made of cement, as you can see here. You can see a D here. And as a matter of fact, he used the letters A-R-T-A-U-D, Artaud, which he found in a warehouse in the city of Modena. And the letters were messily positioned throughout the labyrinth. So visitors were supposed to walk through this installation, and they were supposed to interact with it via a multi-sensorial engagement. Consider the fact that these objects came from the dump, so they were probably quite smelly. So the smell was a big part of the experience. So with this installation, which brought together, as I said, doors covered with graffiti, old and moldy wooden boards, and a broad range of heterogeneous items, and these letters. So these letters, which had a verbal presence, but also a very material presence, big letters made of cement, Vaccari successfully created a visual poem, we can say, projected onto a real space. So this is the experience that led him straight to the conception of his exhibitions in real time. And his first exhibition in real time, entitled Maschere, Masks, was held in 1969 at the Civic Gallery of Varese, which is a public space. During the vernissage, the artist distributed to visitors about 100 copies of the same black and white portrait of a smiling, white, middle-aged man. These portraits were mounted on a thick cardboard with a handle at its base, so they could be used as masks. Once the distribution was over, the lights of the gallery were turned off, and shortly afterwards, Vaccari started exploring the dark space with a flashlight in one hand and a camera in the other. So he turned the flashlight on and off, casting it upon the attendees and taking their pictures. Mimicking the search methods used by the police, he attempted to drag each individual out of the crowd. So as a reaction, the attended tried to defend themselves using the masks. So transformed from a crowd of extras into the main protagonists of the scene by a flashlight that singled them out, people instinctively responded as though protecting themselves from some threat, hiding behind the mask, using it as a way to return to anonymity. So what the point here is that Vaccari presents photographs both as images and as material objects and social agents. The exhibition is centered upon the participants' reappropriative and paradoxical use of photography as an instrument of defense against photography itself, because Vaccari was trying to take their picture, as a means of resistance to stereotype, surveillance, and the excessive of individuation typical of the most institutional applications of the medium: police photography, the mugshots, identification. The photograph that Vaccari used for the mask was a portrait of Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater was a conservative Republican senator who ran for the US president elections in the election in 1964. So what Vaccari did is he reproduced numerous identical copies of this authorial portrait. We're talking about a portrait by Richard Avedon. So it was, and it was a portrait by a famous photographer and of a very famous political figure. And he presented this portrait as a mask, as the stereotypical, thus false representation of a subject deprived of all individuality and interiority. So we used this face, this portrait, both as a public substitute for subjectivity. So in this exhibition in real time, Vaccari used photography not as a document faithful to reality, but as an instrument of farcical theater, of fiction and dissimulation. And again, the participants were caught in their instinct to protect themselves against the voyeuristic impulses of social taxonomy, of control, evoked by the cliché of the policeman with the flashlight and the camera. So through these strategies, Vaccari addressed the conditions of contemporary subjectivity and the related practices of portraiture, of photographic portraiture, as characterized by social stereotypes, by the invasion of privacy, by falsehood, and even assault. So these are very, very contemporary and up-to-date and very, very important themes nowadays, which Vaccari was taking up back in the late 19th 1960s. During the 1970s, Vaccari continued using the same strategies, and I'm now going to show two more exhibitions in real time devoted to portraiture, which are, the first one is the exhibition in real time number 6, entitled The Electronic Beggar. In 1973, Vaccari was invited to take part in a show at Neue Gallery in Graz. Once in Graz, what he did is he was walking around the city and he came across this bus stop where a blind beggar was asking for alms. So he recorded, he made a video. And then once the beggar was gone, he positioned on his spot a television set showing a fixed frame video of the beggar's hat. And then superimposed on the image was a message that said, "The blind will be back soon." So the hat on the image appears as seen from a passerby who, looking down quickly while walking by, only sees a hat containing some coins and two hands. The beggar, for the passerby, has no face. We avoid looking at the beggar's face. But inside the television screen, the beggar is turned into a star, and it becomes the catalyst of the attention of a careless passerby, suddenly transformed into an attentive spectator. So, the television is transformed from a means of mass communication for public and official messages within the privacy of the home into an instrument of private, personal self-representation in public spaces. So again, we see Vaccari reversing strategy of displacement. So the sense of the work stems from these reversals in the social scale, where the beggar appears as instantly mythified, while the passerby, suddenly transformed into a spectator, slips down below the beggar in the social scale and becomes more interested in him than it would be if he were there in flesh and blood. So the point here is to stimulate people to question themselves about their social identity, about where they stand in society, about the automatism of everyday behaviors and experiences. The second exhibition in real time that I'm going to show you is number 7, and it's entitled Instant Myth. In 1974, Vaccari was invited by curator Daniela Palazzoli to show his work at Galleria 291 in Milan. He asked for the show to last only one day, and he also asked to use 2 separate rooms of the gallery, only 2. During the short exhibition, at the entrance, he welcomed the visitors in the first room and took their photographs with a Polaroid camera. Then he made sure that they continued to be entertained for a couple of minutes while the picture came out, the Polaroid came out, and then he projected it with a projector onto a wall in the second room. So then when the visitor entered the room, was surprised by seeing his or her own blown up portrait covering the gallery wall. And then Vaccari rephotographed the whole scene. Okay, so he took a picture of the visitor in front of the projected image. So in perfect tune with the 1960s cultural and political climate, Vaccari defined himself as an aesthetic operator engaged in the activation of processes rather than in the production of art objects. His artistic practice, as I have shown, stemmed from the need of engaging with reality, and his approach to making and exhibiting photography resulted from a dialogue with the viewers/participants, and it had the dimension of social practicability. Vaccari placed a great deal of importance on the material dimensions of objects and emphasized the role of photography as a social, as a social agent, rather than as the expression of someone's authority. For him, photographs are not just representations, but material objects that activate, as I said, multisensorial involvements. They do not merely record reality, they operate on it, and in the process, they determine it and they modify it. So, on the occasion of an exhibition entitled The Self and Its Double, a century of photography, of portrait photography in Italy, 1895 to 1995. So this is an exhibition held in 1995 at the Venice Biennale. Vaccari displayed some of the materials pertaining to his famous photo booth project at the Biennale of 1972. And although more than 20 years had passed, some visitors took out photo strips or ID pictures from their wallets and inserted them between the glass panels protecting the 1972 prints. Similar scenes, as you can see here in the picture, similar scenes were repeated in the following year when the show toured to the Forte Belvedere in Florence. So this showed that the 1972 Venice Biennale project never came to an end, and that the energy liberated on that occasion continued and still continues to produce reality in ways that were and are autonomous from the artist's intentions, that the work triggers in the minds of the triggered and still triggers in the minds of the visitors new associations and new gestures. Now, if I have, I don't know, yeah, I will conclude with an anecdote reported by Vaccari that can be used to understand to what extent the content of an image can sometimes be a marginal fact with respect to its actual social life, even in the case of ID pictures. And this is Vaccari. Before the war, my father owned a photography studio in a small village close to Modena. One day, a middle-aged lady entered the shop asking for her ID picture to be taken because she had to go visit her son who lived far away. But she needed them right away. My father explained her that this was impossible, but she insisted. So he opened the drawer and pulled out some ID picture that had been there for quite some time because no one had come to collect them. He suggested her to use one of these pictures for her ID. The woman, surprised, cried, "But this is not me." And my father, "I know, but you are the only one who knows that." The woman got convinced by my father's argument and accepted the deal. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Nicoletta Leonardi, por esta conferencia absolutamente maravillosa.
Thank you so much, Nicoletta Leonardi, for this very wonderful conference.
Thank you. Thank you for also to the people who attended.
Muchísimas gracias, como decía.
So thank you so much, Nicoletta, for bringing us closer to an artist who is not very well known in Spain, an author, an artist who's a key artist to fully understand this very important period of transformation and change, where different artistic practices converge with the use of photography or photographic practices. I believe your conference is tremendously significant and important in this area, because when we talk about this period and artistic practices and the use of photography at that time, it has been common to minimize the complexity and the importance of these uses. because the message was that photography was mainly used to document the ephemeral nature of happenings and performances, that photography played a key role as a documentary tool. However, your view, your approach is much broader, because there's much more to photography than that. As you have underlined, mentioning the importance of those unexpected uses and the importance of photography in transforming artistic practices. Just you've talked about Vaccari's artistic and photographic references as a young artist. So I have a question for you. How did Vaccari influence his contemporaries? I mean, the influence of his real time exhibitions, did they have a huge impact? Were they just a one-off thing in Italy? Were they copied or emulated? Or was it just a one-off thing? Did they have a huge impact on other artists? I mean, perhaps briefly, you could summarize the influence of his real-time exhibitions at the time and now.
Okay, so yes, Vaccari was, I mean, at first, at the Venice in the early 70s, Vaccari was quite popular. Not so much internationally, maybe, but in Italy, he was very popular among artists and photographers as well. But then one aspect of his work, which is the fact that his work was not easily sold within galleries, because photography was not accepted as an art form within galleries, within Italian art galleries. One, two, Vaccari's use of photographs was very controversial for the art market, and still is. And this is one of the reasons for his work is now only in the past 10, 15 years is becoming to be collected by big, important institutions. So he had an impact. He also had a strong, although he could not make it through the art market. So, and that had then in turn an effect on his popularity. But Vaccari was very, and still is, sort of a father figure for Italian contemporary photographers, and he has been sort of a father figures for contemporary, I mean, for Italian photographers, such as, for instance, Luigi Ghirri, because Vaccari's interest in the urban environment and in the banal and minor aspects of the urban environment was then in very different ways, maybe more traditional ways, more, I mean, I wouldn't say traditional, but in ways that were more typically photographical. I don't know if if you understand me when, but they were taken up, and they were then taken on by figures such as Guido Guidi, by figures such as Luigi Ghirri, and even, for instance, people like Mario Cresci, who is not much younger than Vaccari, but they all looked at him because he was a great intellectual, because he also wrote. He was a writer, he was a curator. He wasn't just an artist. He was a very influential intellectual who curated, who wrote, besides exhibiting his work. And also, he was a photographer who was not a photographer. So he was an artist using photography. So he was a bridge towards the art world, which was a big interest of many photographers at the time. So he's been a very, very, and nowadays, even younger generation artists are still looking at his work, because I think it should be clear by now by what I said, that the themes and subjects he engaged with are very, very much very important, are still very much up to date, are still very much cool. He was a post-photographer before post-photography, in a way.
Absolutamente. De hecho, en este sentido,
Yes, indeed. Actually, Bernardo Riego's history, Bernardo Riego has sent us a question I would like to read aloud. Beyond the artistic action, if we look at Vaccari's work from the viewpoint of the viewer, and who acts as a model in the photo booth, the question is, doesn't the photo booth, in your opinion, doesn't it anticipate practices which are now institutionalized in social media, such as Instagram? Bernardo Riego goes on saying in the 70s, it would have been impossible to conceive social media as we have them today. But it came up in my mind, when you describe this, I think Vaccari's work echoes today's social media. Perhaps you have something to say about this. It wasn't actually a question, it was a comment.
I wouldn't say Vaccari's work echoes the social media, because certainly Vaccari's work engages with technological tools and with the mass media. So he engages with, for instance, the attention towards the representation of the self that was emerging with the economic miracle and all the. So, in a way, this is a critique of the selfie in a pre-selfie era. So, of course, there is a big parallelism, because Vaccari was on the point. He was criticizing, and he wanted to make people aware of the code of conducts, and he wanted to make people play with their identity, but in a way that, in his perspective, was critical towards stereotypes, right? So what he was trying to do, he was trying to create some sort of revolution through the photo booths. There are similarities, but also differences in purpose.
Sí, y para concluir, ¿hay
and to conclude, is there any other author from the time who focused on those displacements that you've mentioned, the displacement of roads, viewers getting involved in the project itself? Are there similar artists of the time? Or is Vaccari unique in his approach? Are there similar artists of the time, or is Vaccari just a unique artist, at least in Italy?
In Italy, as I said, no, I would say in Italy, Vaccari is pretty much alone as an example within the visual arts, the visual arts, because what he did is he only triggered an event, and then sometimes he even left. So that's a big unique statement that not many people were able to make, and I would say was the only one in Italy working this way within the visual arts. But within literature and theater, things are different, because theater back then in the 60s in Italy and on the international scene was kind of like similar to Vaccari's approach. I mean, so you have to find sources outside the visual arts to see where Vaccari was taking his inspiration from. And others, and similar ways of working, I mean.
No sé si tenemos
As
tiempo.
I was saying, perhaps we have some time left for one last question, which is the following. You presented Vaccari as a link between photography and the art world. In the 70s, you told us photography was not naturally accepted, at least in art galleries. But why do you consider that? Why do you think that integration has not fully taken place? Why does photography and art, why do photography and art run in parallel with no convergence? There's only an integration in those authors, or in very few authors or artists. I believe that's a very interesting question, although it would take us a long time to answer it. Perhaps you'd like to say something about this very far-reaching and broad question. It is true that during those years, we saw an explosion of at least many doors were opened that younger artists still use and cross.
Yeah, during the 1970s, late 60s and 1970s, there was a lot of intermedia and cross-media research that, but then I think there is, thank you for this very, very interesting, although huge, I mean, for these very interesting question, and there is, I mean, it raises huge issues. But one thing I can say is that during the 70s, there was a lot of cross-media practice, and then this sort of disappeared in the 80s, right? But then I think we need to also look at the way art history, the history of photography, film history have been all separate disciplines, and they all have created a narrative that is self-inclusive, self-reflective, and it doesn't. I mean, in my opinion, in my personal opinion, this approach does not reflect the way the complexity of history. So on the one hand, I think that these sort of modernist self-referential approaches to different media have had a strong impact. And I'm not only talking about essays, books, I'm talking also about exhibitions, the way museums are structured. Now we have a photography department, we have a sculpture department, we have an architecture department, and at MoMA, no? So I think it's right in a sense, but I think it has created a lot of, if I may allow me to use the word, monodimensional histories and monodimensional exhibitions and monodimensional works. If you think about the history of photography, we are all interested in photography here. The history of photography is a history primarily made up until only maybe 15, 20 years ago of cameras, of images and authors. No cameras, no mention about instruments, no mention about the photography complex, the material, photography as a material apparatus, no mention about the industry, no mention about amateurs, no mention about a huge portion of, a huge percentage of the photographs that exist in the world cannot be included in those histories of photography. So that has been a big problem that we are starting to sort of get rid of now. And it has been a big problem created by modernism that postmodernism didn't really get rid of. So it took us work coming from anthropology, from culture, material culture, from all a completely different area of research to return to a wider and more complex idea of what photographs are, because
absolutamente. Creo que todo lo que has señalado,
yes, of course, everything you've mentioned in your excellent conference has been tremendously interesting and has piqued our interest to tackle all of those issues, which are of tremendous interest. Some of our guests are expressing their wish to have more time for the Q&A because they're extremely interested in this Q&A, but we have run out of time and we have to bring this to a close. So thank you so much, Nicoletta. It was wonderful to listen to your very generous conference and to enjoy all the materials you've generously shared with us. I would like to urge the attendees to read Nicoletta Leonardi's publications and articles, which are wonderful. I'd like to thank Maria, who's coordinating the cycle. I'd like to thank Eva Quijano, the interpreter, and I'd like to thank Cotton, who leads the technical team and who's managed to deal with that technical glitch we've had. Those things happen. Thank you very much to each and every one of you for your patience and for reconnecting so swiftly. So let me remind you to conclude that our next conference will be held next Saturday. It'll be the last in the cycle. We'll be closing this very long and intense cycle with this conference by Elvira de Enganiosie. We'll talk about the importance of photographic exhibitions in African authors and their diaspora in the past 30 years, and the sense and the importance of exhibitions when analyzed as fundamental platforms in the creation and propagation of an a Black African scenario. So I hope to see you soon next Tuesday. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nicoletta Leonardi. I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye. Bye-bye.